Hello, good morning to you. So thankful for a beautiful day, thankful to God who gives us this day and every day. And we're especially thankful for you. So thankful to have a good number of guests. Thank you for being here. Please know that we want to get to know you better today and any day moving forward. Hope that you'll be back tonight. Hope that you'll be back in future meetings and worship assemblies. We'd love to assist you in any way that we can. Hope you'll take out your Bibles, turn to the Old Testament, to the book of Psalms, and we'll be looking at and kind of camping out in Psalm number 46, Psalm that Ryan opened with, Psalm that Sage read the closing part of for our Bible reading, and we'll look at that Psalm in more detail together in just a moment. Hope that you've seen the pictures from Friday afternoon that have scrolled through the announcements, had a good crowd of helpers. I listened to the bulletin, about 11 volunteers, but I think that was an earlier count. I think we had closer to 15 volunteers who helped, so thank you for each one of your efforts. Ended up having about 85 total, I think 85 to 90 in terms of total people there, so thank you so much for your efforts in making that happen. Be sure to continue to pray for fruit and opportunities like that as we serve and reach out to our community. So thank you so much for all who've made that possible in various capacities. There's a lifeguard from Australia who wrote a little story online, and she said that she was standing on her post along the beach, and a lady came up to her and kind of wanted to do the small talk a little bit, small chat kind of, and she said, well, sea looks kind of rough today. Where's the safe place for me to swim? Well, where should I go swim if I'm going to go swim in the ocean today? And the lifeguard said, well, you need to be sure to stay in between the flags. That's why the flags are there. And the lady talking with her said, well, you know that the sea kind of looks rough between the flags. There are waves coming in shore. And the lifeguard said, well, yes, that's because the water's kind of moving pretty fast. That's where the currents are. If you go out there, it's dangerous. That's why we're telling you, stay between the flags. Even though there's some waves coming in, you'll be safe. And the lady kind of kept arguing with her, and the lifeguard kept saying, well, listen, ma'am, this is the way that it is. So a few minutes later, the lady had left. A few minutes later, there's a distress call from outside the flags, and the lifeguard has to run and go jump in and make a rescue. And as she gets to the person who's struggling to stay afloat, she realizes it's the lady. And as to safety, and she's finally caught her breath and able to talk, she says, I thought this was the safe place. Isn't it important we know where the safe place is? Isn't it important we know exactly the area that is the safest? We all kind of resonate with that principle. And yet we also live in a world where safety can be difficult to come by. That there are places where it's not safe. There are people who will make places that are unsafe. We're also reminded that sometimes nature keeps places from being safe. Disasters, weather can happen such that the world is not safe. So it's a valid question. It's a valid concern. What can we do? What we find is that when this psalm is written, it reminds us that safety is not directly related to the factor of who's on the outside or the enemy, the threat. When you read Psalm, identifier. We're also reminded in the course of a study of this psalm that the most important factor in safety isn't even necessarily the precision, the skill of maybe military people. That you can't just look at who's on the outside walls and say, now we're safe. What Psalm 46 reminds us of is the most important factor with true safety, a truly safe place, is, are we with the Lord? Is the Lord with us? Who is among us? Is God with us and among us? Because we have given our lives and submitted to Him. That is the question. That is the answer to determining a truly safe place. Let's dive in and read, beginning verse 1 of Psalm number 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. What you find in this opening stanza, the first 3 verses, is a very strong declarative statement about the trust of the psalmist. Here it's attributed to the sons of Korah, a group of musicians, a group of those who served Israel. It's a strong statement. Here is our trust, here is our faith, here is our peace. They're expressing likely what Paul would call, Philippians 4 and verse 7, a peace that passes understanding. Peace that comes from God, therefore it's beyond even our ability to understand. Notice verse 1, how he begins to express this peace. God is 2 things, and those ideas are repeated twice in verse 1. God is our refuge and our strength. First, He's our refuge, meaning He is a place for us to run to. He is a source of security and protection. He is for us. Therefore, we can run to Him for help, for protection. But He is also our strength in that He is among us, within us, empowering us. We can run to Him. We can also grow because of Him, because He is in and among us. He's going to repeat those same 2 ideas in that same verse. He is a very present help. What's that mean? He's among us. He's strengthening us. He's active with us. He's a very present help when in time of trouble. Just as He is our fortress, He is a place for us to run to. He is there for us in all things. And you see those 2 themes threaded throughout the entire psalm. We'll get to those again 2 more times in specific. Very important word at the beginning of verse 2. Therefore we will not fear. Notice what they do. They say, verse 1, here's who God is. Here's what He offers us. Then they say, therefore, do something. We want a short, concise way in which we would do well to channel and follow in terms of obedience, in terms of deciding action and values. There it is. We look to the fill in the blank. Based on what God makes known to us, we then adamantly and declaratively say, therefore, we will. And we will not fear, we will not be afraid, followed by another important word, 4 times in the English Standard Version, the word though. You want true peace, it's measured by your all those. Therefore, we will not fear, though, 4 different times. Though the earth gives way, the mountains are picked up and thrown into the sea, though the sea begins to swell, roar, churn, though the mountains tremble at those seas. It's a very powerful picture to think about. That the psalmists here are saying there are some situations that are fundamentally, by nature, scary. But we will not fear because of who our God is. And you'll notice that you see some what's called parallelism in the Hebrew language there in verses 2 and 3. He says, though the mountains, then says, though they be moved to the sea, then it's the waters that roar and foam, and he goes back to where the mountains. So mountain, sea, sea, mountains. It's a Hebrew way of expressing a comprehensive nature. It's a way in which they could say, worst case scenario, we will not fear. We see pictures and images on the news, video on the news, hurricanes, all these disasters, and how fundamentally they change life when they hit, how tragic they are. The psalmist is saying, even when the earth, we will not fear because of who God is and who God is for us and within us. They're saying our worst case scenarios, in those, God is still our source of refuge and strength. As we apply those first 3 verses, do we know what our worst case scenarios are? Are we confident? Are we adamant? Even if we have not experienced them, are we adamant that God will be our source of strength? God will be our fortress to run to if and when we must face those worst case scenarios. And as we ask that question, we then move to also ask the next question, which is how can we develop such a strong, resolute attitude? We read verses 1 through 3, we may say deep down, I want that trust. Where does that trust come from? How can I have such a trust to say declaratively, He is my refuge and strength. I will not fear, we will not fear no matter what. As we keep reading, we'll see a process that'll help us to grow in that trust even more completely. Let's read verse 4. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So now here we see perhaps they're just thinking back to a lot of the kind of combining some details. Perhaps that's the case. Certainly appears the Lord wanted this to be ambiguous enough for us to be able to apply it to our own lives. So we don't know exactly the background of the specifics. But oh, what beautiful thoughts emerge from this section. We see a God who is present. Explain their keep blessing and feeding. God is good and His blessings constantly flowing, just as a river keeps flowing, giving life to all who take from it, who live off of that water. But notice also, verse 5, He Himself is among the people. Not only is He providing, He is there living in the city. He is there among His own people. So it's because of that in the middle of any circumstance, the people have great confidence. He'll help. He'll help when dawn arises. And that's a common phrase throughout the Old Testament, a common experience in some narratives, but also a common thought to anticipate the Lord helping in the morning. Psalm 30 and verse 5, for example, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes. The darkness is difficult, and yet the Lord promises help when dawn comes. Notice verse 6. Remember, this is kind of a little bit more specific. They say, the nations rage, the kingdoms totter. That's parallel back to verses 2 and 3, the mountains and the seas, but now it's not the... It's those who are fighting, those who are attacking, those who are trying to intimidate. That's scary, isn't it? Foreign policy, world powers, those things can be scary in our day, and they were in the time of God's people in the Old Testament just the same. What does God do? What does God provide there? Well, taken care of with provisions no matter what the nations do. But then also, you'll notice verse 6, He utters His voice and the earth melts. See, the kingdoms try to attack with physical armaments. The kingdoms try to leverage physical power, and all the Lord has to do is to speak. The whole earth will melt, will come apart. He has great power over them, even in His voice. It's interesting to go back through the Old Testament. You have a chance this week. Go back through, flip through some of the events. Another suggestion outside of the life of David is the incident with Hezekiah and King Sennacherib of the Assyrians. Some of the details fit that instance too. That's found in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. Repeated in 2 Chronicles 32. Repeated again in Isaiah 36 and 37. It's possible some of the details are connected to that amazing time where God provides deliverance and protection. He helped when morning came. But notice verse 7, the summary of their hope, their trust. The Lord of hosts is with us. He's present. And the God of Jacob is our fortress. He is our protection, the place for which we can run to. And the God of Jacob maybe sounds a little odd because Jacob is not really in the time frame of likely what these events are describing, and yet it's a reminder God has been the protection of Israel for generations. Jacob being the one from whom Israel came, the one whose name was changed to Israel. To say he's the God of Jacob is a reminder that generation after generation after generation, God's promises have stood, including his constant protection of his people, even among and in the midst of these nations who would attack them. So we see some specifics come to the surface. And it's there that we can begin to see God's promises being carried out and God being in our own lives. And that'll draw us to the type of trust explained in verses 1 through 3. But notice the psalm continues, and it's in chapter 46, verses 8 through 11, that we see two commands that will really help us to develop that trust found in verses 1 through 3. We see God's power exhibited. It's on display, and it comes also hanging on two different commands. So, we'll sing songs from time to time where we will sing a command to one another to do something. Sing a command to ourselves to do something. That's similar to what's happening here. We might sing the words, "Send the light." Right? Well, that's what they're doing. They're commanding through song, commanding through this artwork, this poetry of Psalm number 46. Notice the works of the Lord. There's your first command. It's the people saying this one, look at what God has done. Here are those works. How he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear, burns the chariots with fire. What are the works of the Lord? It's time and time again those who would use things of the earth to try to proven to be more the most powerful of enemies, useless. He's rendered them powerless. He makes war cease. You look at the earth, no power has been able to sustain power infinitely. There's always come someone else behind that power who's exercised more power and overtaken them. That's not the case with God. He is victorious such that he can make wars cease altogether were he to choose. He makes war cease altogether. Then notice the specifics. He breaks the bow. He shatters the spear. He burns up the chariots with fire. You read through the history of the Israelites, you'll see time and time again enemies using those very weapons against them. And yet time and time again, God is more powerful than they. We might find ourselves thinking, yeah, but that's bows, that's spears, that's chariots. What do we do today when we have germ warfare, chemical warfare? We have nuclear bombs and other kinds of bombs and missiles. And yet the advice, the commands throughout this psalm are not specific to an era. They will be just the same in our era as theirs. And verse 10 is where we begin to see that. It's a command spoken by God, not by the people, but instead by God himself. If we're going to look at the works of God, we're going to open up the scriptures, we're going to challenge ourselves to see who God is. What we'll also find is that God speaks. And that's what happens in verse 10. God speaks. Be still. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Beautiful phrase, one I'm sure we may have heard from time to time and we've seen in places. Be still and know that I am God. If I begin to think about the singular verses that are familiar to me and comforting to me and inspirational to me, that is one that has long been a favorite of mine for decades now. And yet I'm probably, if I'm being honest, not always fully appreciated in terms of what it means in this psalm. I might be quick to think about it in terms of just finding a situation and a set of circumstances that are calm. Be still. Just stop having to move all the time. Kind of kill the nervous energy. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to find the quiet porch time with your coffee in the morning and listen to the birds chirp. That could be a good thing. It's not a bad thing to listen to the sound of the waves at night at the beach or early in the morning at the beach, or to hear the animals up in the mountains. It's not a bad thing to find that calm and then to seek the Lord in those times with prayer and Bible study. It's a far stronger application in chapter 46, verse 10, though. First, by way of the word still here, be still, is almost always translated in the Old Testament by a concept of either leave or forsake or put off, take off. Not just calm, not just have a seat, but completely abandon, put off. Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel has a vision similar to what Isaiah sees in Isaiah 6. Ezekiel 1, there's 4 angels that prepare Ezekiel for the glory. The text says in Ezekiel 1, 24 and 25, that when they hear the voice from above, the voice of the Lord, they lay down their wings. These mighty messengers, creatures created by God to carry out His will, they lay down the thing by which they carry out that will in the presence of God. They surrender their power to the power of God. The kingdom's tottering, the earth moving, the earth being tossed about. And then He says, be still and know that I am God. He's saying, lay it all down. Surrender it all. Stop fighting against yourself. Stop fighting within yourself. Stop looking outwardly. Stop trying to do it all yourself. But instead, surrender and know that I am truly God. And really, verse 10, He's talking more to than to just kingdoms. Because He says, I will be exalted in the nations. It's going to happen. Now or later, it will happen. I will be exalted in the earth. You see kind of the piecing together of the psalm? I'll be exalted in the nations. That's verse 6. I'll be exalted in the earth. That's verses 2 and 3. God says it's my nature that I will be seen once and for all. You will know, all will know, I am God. So now choose to surrender. Now choose. That's where we begin to develop the trust, the faith, the peace that's expressed. God will be exalted when we humble ourselves completely and totally before Him. Surrender to His will, and therefore know He is a place for us to run to for protection, but also the one within whom He lives and dwells and empowers us to carry out His will. In the 1990s, a painter named Jack Dawson painted this painting, and he titled it Peace in the Midst of the Storm. What's interesting is you see that painting, and at first glance, you certainly see the storm. You see the lightning in the distance. You see the flooding waters. You see the darkness, the clouds. That's certainly a stormy picture. If we were in that moment in real life, it would be a moment that could induce fear. So where is he come off calling this peace in the midst of the storm? It's a small little detail about a third of the way up from the bottom in the middle of the picture. There's a single bird who's made her nest in the hollow of the rock. The storm is going on, the earth is coming apart, the waters are roaring, and yet she has peace because of where she has made her nest, because of where she has chosen to live. And such is the case for God's people. We have peace because we choose to live with Him. He gives us peace as the source of our protection, but also as the one who empowers us. That's peace. Peace that the Israelites had when they wrote this psalm, Psalm number 46. It's peace we can have today. You know, God is such a good God to us and a very present God that the Word, He became flesh and dwelt among us. It was very present in the flesh to make that peace known to us. Jesus would go about preaching and teaching, and when He would interact with people, multiple times He said He could provide rivers of eternal water. That if we would come to him and drink, he would give water that never dries up. It gives eternal life. John 4, John chapter 7. The New Testament makes it clear that God dwells among his people today. He is in the midst of them. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the church is his temple. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Christians are his temple. The nations raged. The kingdoms tottered in the life of Jesus. They did so and conspired together to crucify Jesus. Acts 4, 27 and 28 make it clear there's no respecter here. Both Jews and Gentiles acted to crucify Jesus. The rulers of this age crucified him. 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 8. He has made wars cease. Jesus has. Ephesians 2 says he is our peace. All of this, he gives us proof. He gives us certainty. He makes it clear this is available today because of one specific morning when dawn came. There was darkness on a Friday night. There was darkness on a Saturday night. But when dawn came Sunday morning, death could not hold him in the tomb. Acts 2 and verse 24. Because of the resurrection, when God helped, when morning dawned, we can now have this peace the psalmist centuries ago wrote about. And we have the promise that this same Jesus will be exalted. He'll be exalted in our lives today. He will be exalted at judgment. We will confess that name. The challenge is to respond to Psalm 46 and verse 10, to respond to the Lord's invitation today. Not put it off, not wait, not decide later, but know that we will confess, but it's our choice as to when we confess. Will we confess that sweet name as Lord in this life and this time? Or will we be driven in humility at the day of judgment when it's too late to confess that he indeed was God and Lord? This morning, do you know? If you need to do that, you can do that in the simple way he outlined. To express and acknowledge faith in him, to turn from sin, to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. You can do that and do it today and not have to put it off at all. It'll be the best decision you could make. You've been fighting against yourself, fighting with yourself, fighting with others, and fighting against God. Ultimately, you can make things right because he longs to forgive you. And we are here ready to help as an extension of his love, knowing that we love you and are here for you. If you have those needs, would you come? And come now as we sing.